Anytime you beg another man to set you free, you'll never be free. Freedom is something that you have to do for yourself.
Okay, so today was day 20 of the trial. It was the first day of closing oral arguments, and it was by far the least interesting day of the trial so far. Almost everything that was discussed today were things that had come up previously, obviously. I mean, the only thing that came up that was sort of new was COPA pointing out the inconsistencies in certain statements. So inconsistencies in statements that were made throughout the trial, when testimony from one person contradicted testimony from another person. It wasn't actually pointed out at the time, so all those little inconsistencies, that the things that didn't line up from one story to another, those were pointed out today. And COPA's lawyers, they did a really good job. I mean, it was just Jonathan Hough today. It was just Jonathan Hough speaking all day. He was interrupted a couple times. He was asked a few questions, maybe 2 or 3 times by the judge. Other than that, though, it was just him talking nonstop, so I'm sure he'll have a sore voice. But he did a really good job. I mean, there were some people in the gallery who I believe had just been sitting in the trial for the first time today. And I think those people probably walk away with the impression that Craig's just going to get blown out of the water, because these are really good lawyers, and even though they didn't do a great job of arguing with Craig on technical matters when he was on the stand, it shows that you get what you pay for with a lawyer when they're doing these closing arguments. I mean, if you're someone who hadn't observed any of the trial until today and you sat in on the trial, like I said, it would probably seem quite damning for Craig, but it would only seem damning if you didn't understand how weak the expert report and the expert testimony from COPA was. That is really what stood out to me today. I mean, they were just summarizing their whole case. There's 12 kind of main points that they stated that they had about Craig not being Satoshi. But the theme for the day was, I mean, the theme that we saw throughout the entirety of the trial, and that was that COPA's lawyers were heavily reliant on the Madden report. And really just the amount of times that they referenced the Madden report today, or referenced Madden's testimony on the stand, it really goes to show that their entire claim that Craig is a serial forger really rests on Madden. And they tried to argue that the drafting assistance he received from Bird and Bird in writing his report didn't taint his independence as an expert. But I'm sure Craig's team is going to thoroughly rebut that point in their closing, because I'm quite convinced, just by how heavily they're relying on the Madden report, that if Craig's team could get the Madden report stricken and not accepted as evidence, that it'd almost be a sure victory for Craig. I mean, Madden's reports are the reports that more or less state that Craig's documents are forgeries. The other expert reports don't deal with anything being forged or fake. So all of the allegations leveled against Craig's documents being forged are leveled against him by Mr. Madden. And to be honest, some of the allegations were corroborated by Craig's own expert, who wasn't cross-referenced in this trial, by the way, because apparently he was selected by Kristen Ager-Hansen. That's what I gathered from somewhere. I have to double check that, make sure that that's correct. But that was my understanding as to why Craig's team didn't want to rely on their own expert witness. Essentially, that they felt that to some extent that they had an expert who was not only somewhat unfit to give the expert testimony that was requested of them, but somewhat compromised, or potentially compromised. But really, yeah, I mean, it was a dull day. Like I said, the lawyers made a convincing case for COPA's arguments. because they're good lawyers, and that's what any good lawyer is going to make their case sound good in closing arguments, even if it is a weak case. And I think that's really what they did. They made a weak case sound really strong. And when you have a good legal team, that's what they'll do. And yeah, I mean, if you're someone who was observing, it sounded terrible. It sounded like it was a really damning day for Craig. But it wasn't. That wasn't the case when they were actually arguing all of these details out in the stand. Anyway, that was my impression as just a lay observer who watched the trial. So, really, I mean, the 12 points that they had, I'll reiterate these. There was 12 things that they said indicated that Craig couldn't be Satoshi. And that was that the Bitcoin white paper was obviously made in open office and not LaTeX, and that Satoshi should have known that. And he should have been familiar with the Adam Back dialogue between Adam Back and Satoshi. But again, that's something where your memory after 15 years isn't going to be exact, so being slightly off in those details, that's to be expected. Human memory isn't like computer memory. You can't recall information accurately after 15 years. There's going to be details that you don't recall accurately anymore after that time. Next was the Wei Dai influence, saying that there were inconsistencies in things Craig had said and Satoshi had said about being influenced by Wei Dai. The PGP key, BTC code, he wasn't familiar with the check block header or the unsigned integer, which again, these are weak arguments because it's really nitpicky, and Craig, his explanation of the unsigned integer was not entirely incorrect. He was just kind of at a loss for words to explain it at that moment. It was kind of obvious that he was just at a loss for words. For me anyway, just observing, that was the impression I got. I didn't really find that it was that damning. It was just, it happens to me all the time. There's a piece of information that's just at the tip of my tongue. I can't quite express it at that moment. It'll come back to me a few minutes later. It happens to everyone. But what was the next thing here? Some website wasn't actually hosted on his server, and that if he was Satoshi, he should have known that. The mining requirements, that he shouldn't have needed 69 computers to set up the early mining. Again, that's discounting the idea laid out by Zheng that those extra machines may have been needed for diagnostic and testing purposes. Let's see, what else was there? Oh, the other one, I missed that one, is Patch Tuesday. I should have known about that. That his inconsistencies or the things that he'd said about Patch Tuesday wouldn't have lined up with what Satoshi's impression of that would have been. And then we had the Bitcoin transactions that he didn't know that he hadn't sent BTC to Zuko, and that he should have had greater knowledge of the Genesis block, and that he wouldn't have he should have understood that Satoshi had no problem with the transfer of the project to GitHub. So yeah, I mean, there's not a lot to the Madden. There's not a lot to COPA's case without the Madden report. A lot of this really hinges on the Madden report. So just my general takeaway is, I listened to this guy reference Dr. Madden all day. If Craig's team can get the Madden report stricken from evidence, I think it goes to Craig fairly easily. Yeah, that's my take from the day. Hopefully tomorrow will be a little bit more interesting. I expect it might be shorter. I don't think the developer team will need as much time. Yeah, we'll see what happens. I'll have another video tomorrow.